frequently it's really hard to get to everything that is contained in a particular text in the short time that's allotted for a sermon on a Sunday morning. And that's why it's sometimes useful to do this little segment called Left on the Desk, where I'll go into a little more detail about a particular part of the scripture that we were studying that I just didn't have time to get to on Sunday morning. Now, nerd alert, this might be too short for some of you, but it might be too long and seem too in-depth for others. Bear with me, though, if you're interested in this question. Here's what came up last week. In the sermon on Sunday, I maintained that Jesus' teaching in Luke chapter 21 was a prophecy about two distinct but related events. The first event, which I believe is most clear up through about verse 24, is about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. The second event, which I proposed becomes the subject of verse 25 and following through the end of the chapter, is Jesus' return at the end of the age. Both are about the judgment of God. Both are about looking forward and looking for signs, but the first has a near-term fulfillment and the second has yet to be fulfilled. Now, several of you noted a verse that I didn't spend a lot of time on in the sermon. The work that I did on it was left on the desk. The verse is verse 32, where Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And the question then becomes, what does Jesus mean by this generation? Because verse 31 comes at the end of the parable of the fig tree and well after verse 24, which I proposed is when the prophecy shifts from the imminent destruction of the temple in 70 AD to the future return of Jesus at the end of the age. Now, at this point, we have to admit, like I said on Sunday about the entirety of the passage, that there is some really spirited debate and disagreement, even among theologians in our tradition who normally agree on almost everything when it comes to this passage. Particularly on this verse, J.C. Ryle noted in his understated British way that this is a point on which the commentators differ wildly. But let's look at it. At first glance, this generation in that verse means those who are alive, most naturally, when some people read it, seems to refer most naturally to those people who were alive when Jesus spoke the words. And if that's the case, then Jesus had to be speaking about the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and not about his return at the end of the age. Or some might say he was simply wrong, which is what some critical scholars argue, but Christians can rule that out. Now, that's not the position that I took in the sermon on Sunday, but many good scholars and theologians do believe that this generation in that verse is referring to those who were alive when Jesus spoke the words. And as a result, it was not talking about the end of the age when Jesus returns again. Now, on the other hand, my assumption in the way that I approach the passage, following Philip Ryken and J.C. Ryle and Leon Morris and some others, now they disagreed on some particulars, but they all maintained that this generation in that verse was not referring to those who were alive when Jesus spoke the words. They all look at the context and they conclude, I think fairly, that the immediate context in the statement about this generation not passing away until all these things have taken place is about Jesus' teaching about the end of the age. Cosmic signs happening and the Son of Man coming in clouds in great glory, with the parable of the fig tree as an illustration of that. And then this verse happens. So the immediate context seems to say Jesus had to have been talking about the end of the age at this point and not the destruction of Jerusalem. Admittedly, though, you still have to ask, what did Jesus mean by this generation? Now, what some people will point out, and I think helpfully, is that word generation, while we think of it in relation to a people in a particular time, can often very rightly refer to a group that's defined by ethnic identity rather than the time in which they were born. And many people, and this is where J.C. Ryle falls, think that this most naturally points to the Jewish people. A people that, despite its relatively small size globally and despite multiple attempts to wipe it out, continues to exist as a distinct group and will continue to exist until Jesus returns again. Others would point out that the word generation can also refer to people having the same spiritual condition. Now, in this case, not an ethnic people, but a people of a similar spiritual state. Not when they live, generation, but how they live. This group of people either could be referring to people who reject Jesus and will continue to reject Jesus until Jesus returns again, until all these things have happened. Or this generation, referring to God's people, who are always in the world and will always be in the world until Jesus returns and all these things have happened. In one case, people who resist God will always exist until the end of the age. In the other case, people who follow God will always exist until the end of the age. But in both cases, we're talking about a type of person that will continue to live in the world until the end of the age. And so all these things, the things that will not happen until this generation passes away, are referring to the signs of the coming of the Son of Man, not to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, more broadly, what are we to do with this and with other disagreements like this? It isn't as if God is surprised that his people have had sharp disagreements on topics related to the return of Jesus. He doesn't sit on the throne of heaven regretting that he didn't add an additional chapter or two to clear it all up. So at the very minimum, he probably wants us to be humble and charitable with one another as we talk about these things. That we should seek to understand alternative views, to defend our own views with Scripture, and then, and I think this is critical, step back and rejoice together about what we know for certain. I once heard the theologian and pastor John Piper say that in studying the book of Revelation, he coined for himself the phrase, the doctrine of least meaning. And by that, he meant, for everything that we might not know about the end of the age and the timing of Jesus' return and what that will look like, what we do know is absolutely glorious. And this is what we know for certain and without dispute. Jesus is coming again to judge all of us according to God's perfect standard. And we know that only those who have trusted in the righteousness of Christ by faith will be acquitted. And we know that the wrath of God is a sobering thing. But for the Christian, Christ's return is our hope, because it is the fulfillment of a promise to right all that is wrong in the world and usher his people into his glorious presence without sin, where we will all enjoy the glories of the pleasures of God forevermore. That's some of what I didn't get to on Sunday. That's what was left on the desk.